What moment in history that's hard to believe it actually happened. The time that Nero tried to kill his mother by putting her on a ship that was supposed to sink. Except it didn't work because she climbed onto a bed and floated back to the shore. To fix this, he sent a small group of soldiers to go meet her on the beach and stab her to death. The mast was supposed to fall on her as well, but it landed on one of her friends next to her, and so one of the crew had to saw a hole in the bottom of the boat. When one of her other friends realized what was happening, she yelled out, "I am, name, mother of Emperor Nero, come to my aid," or something along those lines, and this drew the attention of the oarsmen, who promptly beat her to death with the paddles, allowing Nero's mother to escape. The way I've heard it told, she made her way back to the palace and told her son what had happened, who then ordered soldiers to kill her. When they approached, she bared her stomach and invited them to stab her where her ungrateful son had been born from. When the English monarchy was restored in 1660, King Charles II ordered the posthumous execution of the members of parliament involved in his dad's execution who had died during the interregnum. Basically, he wasn't going to let the fact that the guys were dead get in the way of vengeance. He literally had them dug up, hung the corpses, and then beheaded them. I already posted once, but I got another one. There were still Japanese soldiers well into the 1970s who had no idea the World War II was over. Like, they just got left behind by the Navy and held out on isolated islands for decades. One guy in particular spent his time feuding with the Filipino police. Everyone tried to tell him the war was over, but he thought it was a bunch of propaganda. Word eventually got back to Japan, where they had to look up his commanding officer, who had since left the military for a career as a businessman, and fly him to the Philippines. Only after receiving a direct order from his commanding officer did the guy stand down. That time Emperor Napoleon escaped from the island he was imprisoned on after his army was finally defeated, snuck back into France under the nose of King Louis XVIII and literally every royal guard and roadblock from Marseille to Paris. Then when he was actually caught just outside of Paris, he managed to persuade the soldiers, who just so happened to be former Bonapartists, to escort him into Paris, where he managed to successfully cause the king to flee, on top of raising a full army to wage war against Europe again. The only time in history an emperor took back an entire country just by waving his hat. The Newport Essex scandal. Look, this was shortly after World War I. There was an investigation launched to root out homosexuals in the Navy. The investigation was conducted by having undercover agents, have sex with men, and to report their findings in very vivid detail to the guys heading the investigation. No homo. Also, FDR was Secretary of the Navy at the time and signed off on the whole thing. According to The Last Battle by Cornelius Ryan. On May 1, 1945, the day after Adolf Hitler committed suicide, General Hans Krebs was sent under a white flag to deliver a letter to General Vasily Chukov of the Red Army, containing surrender terms acceptable to Joseph Goebbels, then acting as Chancellor of Germany. Krebs had not announced that he was coming, taking Chukov by surprise. At that time, he was being interviewed by two war correspondents, Konstantin Simonov and Yevgeny Dolmatovsky, accompanied by musician Matvey Blanter, who wrote the internationally famous Katusha. When he was informed that Krebs was waiting for him outside, Chukov, wanting to speak to Krebs as soon as possible, while making sure the meeting would seem official, quickly gave the interviewers, who were dressed in uniform, medals so that they would act as his staff. Not knowing what to do with Blanter, however, since he was dressed in civilian clothing, Chukov hastily shoved him into a cupboard and ordered him to keep quiet, which he managed to do for the duration of the meeting. Unfortunately, the meeting came to nothing, as the Soviets would accept nothing but unconditional surrender. Once the meeting is over, just as Krebs and his men are leaving with the bad news, Blanter passes out from lack of oxygen, and falls out of the cupboard onto the floor of the room right in front of them. There was a scene in the film Downfall showing the events of this meeting, but the scene was removed out of worry that it would not be taken seriously, even though it really happened. A Russian sculptor was commissioned to make a statue of Christopher Columbus as a gift for the Americans, kinda like the Statue of Liberty, After the painstaking process of making it and shipping it to America, the Americans essentially said no thanks and sent it back. So the sculptor cut off the head of the statue, sculpted a new one and called it a statue for Peter the Great. You can still see it in Moscow. When your boy Caesar was kidnapped by pirates and he laughed at them for low ransom and told them to raise it. Then over the course of time it took the Romans to raise the money. Caesar developed something of a friendship with the pirates to the point where he was joining in with their games and exercises. When the ransom arrived, he handed it over to the pirates and was set free. With his freedom he returned to the pirate ship, which was still where he left it, took them as prisoners and then crucified them. Edit: yeah, I forgot to mention that he told them previously he'd crucify them, but they thought he was joking. The 335 years war between the Isles of Scilly and the Netherlands started in 1651 and ended in 1986 when a historian was trying to debunk the myth that the two were at war. He discovered that the two were in fact at war and didn't know it. This prompted the signing of a peace treaty to end the longest war to have 0 battles and no bloodshed. The Dutch more or less declared war and forgot about it. The Dutch ambassador joked that it must have been harrowing for the Scillians to know we could have attacked at any moment. Edit: to correct some ambiguity, the Isles of Scilly are a region of Britain, not a country. The most respectful territory control that currently happens. Hans Island is a small island that is contested territory between Canada and Denmark. Every few months, a platoon from one of the nations goes to the island, takes down the other country's flag to put up their own, drinks a crate of booze left behind by the other army. They'll drop a crate of their own booze and then leave. Viking Siege of Pierce. Leader pretended he was dead and asked to be buried in Paris. The French let him in, he jumped out the coffin and opened the city gates to his army. Edit: wasn't Paris, I believe it was an Italian town near Rome. Leader was Bjorn Ironside, not Ragnar. I can't believe Richard Nixon issued an executive order in 1971 which imposed a 90-day freeze on all wages and prices in the United States in order to arrest price inflation. How did anyone believe that would be a good idea or think that it would even be possible to enforce such a policy? The Battle of Teutoburg Forest. So there's this Germanic chieftain, Segimorus, and as punishment for fighting Rome, the Romans took his son Arminius and attempted to turn him into one of them. He was raised by a Roman family, given a Roman military education, and ended up as an officer in a force under General Publius Quinctilius Varus. In the meantime, Segimorus dies, so his son is by all rights the chieftain of this tribe. Varus was sent to Germany to fight Arminius' tribe, and, wouldn't you know it, Arminius disappears one night. In the morning, the army moves off through the forest, and, shockingly, gets ambushed by Arminius and an army of angry Germans, who wipe out Varus' army. Varus himself commits suicide to avoid facing punishment for this disaster, and Rome never tried to take territory on that side of the Rhine ever again. Edit: this is now my most upvoted comment. Cool. That World War I started because a Serbian terrorist plot to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary failed miserably. When a terrorist threw a bomb at the Archduke's car, he forgot there was a 10 seconds delay and so it harmlessly bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded under the car behind him. The terrorist who threw the bomb then tried to swallow a cyanide capsule and drown himself in a river, but the river was only a few inches deep and the capsule just made him sick and so he was arrested. Then Ferdinand's driver got lost looking for the hospital so the Archduke could visit those injured in the attack, and during his search for the hospital went down a street that he had to slowly reverse out of. That street just happened to be the street where one of the terrorists decided to stop for lunch at a deli after his failed assassination plot, and so the terrorist whose group's initial attempt failed suddenly found himself 10 feet, literally, away from the Archduke and was able to kill both the Archduke and his wife with 2 shots from his gun which promptly jammed. The Archduke was hit in the jugular, his wife in the abdomen. All of this was done in the name of Serbian independence from Austria-Hungary and at the behest of Serbian military officers. Serbia then dissolved the group in 1916, 2 years after the start of the war, and executed its leaders. I have one. On March 10, 1942, just over 3 months after Pearl Harbor, the Americans fled Java Island. But they inadvertently left behind 18 Americans. So a person called Master Sergeant Harry Hayes repaired a B-17 and, despite having no flight training before, let alone flown a plane, he successfully piloted the bomber, along with the other 17 Americans, to Australia, even without maps and instruments. Pretty close. Hayes didn't pilot the plane himself. A civilian pilot, who had briefly flown a B-17 before, and a Dutch officer were the pilot and co-pilot on the flight. The neat part though was they only had 3 good engines but still made the 8-hour flight to Australia with the last of the evacuees, including the civilian pilot's wife. Not being old enough to remember it happening, it's really difficult for me to imagine what it would be like if someone literally shot the US president. Like I can't even imagine seeing that news come across the wire. It seems like the biggest holy shit moment I can imagine. Honestly, with the unbridled hatred for the current and previous president from each side, I'm surprised that it hasn't happened at some point in the last 9 years. The Taiping Rebellion. Nearly 100 million people dead because some guy failed his exams to become a government official and had horrible stress-induced fever dreams he deemed to be visions. 5 years later, he decided the visions meant he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, meant to spread Christianity throughout China and overthrow the existing dynasty. So he gathered a following, created an army, and killed his way across China. More people died than the combatants of both world wars combined. If someone wrote a movie with that plot, you'd think it was ridiculous beyond belief. Such an immense loss of life, and most people in the Western world don't even know that it happened. The Armenian genocide and the whole death march. Even crazier because it only happened about 100 years ago. Like literally just 1.5 million people, walking across a desert, until they died of exhaustion or reached a concentration camp to die. Completely awful, has to be one of the worst ways to die. Not to mention it wasn't really talked about at all for a very long time. A guy manages to sneak up to Andrew Jackson with 2 pistols and tries to shoot him. Both his pistols misfire, despite that being statistically impossible, and Jackson realizes what just happened. Jackson proceeds to nearly beat the would-be assassin to death, and probably would have, if he hadn't been pulled apart from the man by several congressmen, including then-incumbent Davy Crockett. Battle of Ramree Island. A World War II offensive to retake part of Burma held captive by Japan that resulted in the largest number of crocodile-related deaths in a single historical event. Quote from a solider and naturalist who participated in the effort. That night, of the 19th of February 1945, was the most horrible that any member of the M.L. motor launch crews ever experienced. The scattered rifle shots in the pitch-black swamp punctured by the screams of wounded men crushed in the jaws of huge reptiles, and the blurred worrying sound of spinning crocodiles made a cacophony of hell that has rarely been duplicated on Earth. At dawn the vultures arrived to clean up what the crocodiles had left. Of about 1,000 Japanese soldiers that entered the swamps of Ramree, only about 20 were found alive. Pretty wild. Edit, Burma not India. The Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK had all his flag officers and half his cabinet pressuring him to attack the Soviet Union. He did agree that if the Soviets or Cubans attacked the US, he would invade Cuba. There were armed tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba and the local commanders had authority to use them if they saw any US forces approaching the island. The US sent high-speed reconnaissance jets over Cuba to photograph the missile sites at low altitude. The Cubans fired on the aircraft, but they all returned safely home. When they landed, the Secretary of Defense was on hand and asked about the bullet holes in the aircraft. He was itching for a reason to invade Cuba. The lead pilot lied and said they were from bird strikes, they encountered no hostile fire. That was the point. That one moment when that pilot lied. If he had said we encountered some small arms fire, but no permanent damage, then the Secretary of Defense would have pushed to invade Cuba. If that had happened, the local strategic commanders would have engaged them with tactical nuclear weapons. And the US would most likely have retaliated with a full nuclear strike. That's how close we came to nuclear annihilation. There are a few other close calls that were saved by individuals, but for me this is the one because we were living in a powder keg and giving off sparks. The fall of the Soviet Union. I know it's very easy in retrospect to say, yeah, they were doomed. Growing up in the 70s and 80s, though, it wasn't so easy to see. We didn't know what they were doing, or why. All we knew was, they had thousands of missiles pointed at us. Even when Gorbachev instituted and as a way to reach détente with us, there was still a sense of secrets. That Iron Curtain didn't come down so easily. I remember when Chernobyl melted down, we knew it had happened about a week before they admitted it. It was picked up by satellites. That last coup. It was an utter shock. To have Yeltsin step forward and tell everyone he was president of Russia? I about fell out of my chair. Edit, I can't spell in Russian. That time the first secretary of the Treasury was shot and killed by the third vice president. That time a senator beat the living shit out of another senator for talking shit with a gold-tipped cane on the Senate floor. That time business interests got a progressive reformer as the vice president to keep him from doing anything, because what the hell does a VP do, shortly before the president was shot? That time a president who had been shot died a torturous death over the course of 2 months because the man treating him thought that germs weren't proven science and wouldn't wash his hands. That time the United States spent years talking about consent of the governed and spent a century governing Puerto Rico without its consent. That time the man who spent a lifetime decrying civil rights and was an ardent segregationist had a child by his black housemaid when she was 17. The Europeans gave Native Americans blankets infested with smallpox. This was purposely done. Black prisoners being given syphilis as an experiment. MKUltra tests on soldiers as an experiment to have some sort of mind control and manipulation. Reagan being denied fund for Nicaragua rebels, which led to CIA secretly bringing coke into US, which later was turned to crack ready rock by the largest crack dealer Rick Ross and was issued to black communities. This money was used to fund those rebels.